Okay, quick recap. I think everyone was here last week, or almost everyone. Sherry was not here. So last week, we covered the death of Saul, King Saul. It was technically finishing up the lesson before. We saw the death of King Saul. We saw David being made king over Judah first, the tribe of Judah. We saw a long period of civil war throughout the country. Eventually, we had the death of Saul's son, who was reigning as king in the rest of the country. David was finally coronated over the entire nation of Israel. And then we saw briefly David and some of his men taking the city of the Jebusites, which we will later come to know as Jerusalem. Snuck in through the water tunnels and were able to take that city. And that's basically where we pick up tonight. But why don't we open up in prayer before we get too far? Holy Father, I thank you for this night. Thank you for even a small group that's able to make it out. I pray that we can still benefit, still have some good discussions, some good insights into your word, and just pray that you be with us during this time of study. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, so if you don't know already, we are on page 73 in your book, 2 Samuel 6 in your Bible. But even though there's just a few of us, why don't we see what we can do with these questions? I think they're interesting, so I'll give you a second to think about it. Question 1 in your book. It says, describe a time when you finished a great accomplishment and expected to receive some recognition. And it doesn't specify whether you did or did not receive that recognition.
I don't even expect to receive recognition.
Even for your great accomplishments? Yeah, I was trying to think of for myself, and I'm like, what do I consider a great accomplishment? That's kind of tough. But then I was in my office, looked at the wall, and I'm like, okay, there's a degree sitting there. I don't know if it was a great accomplishment, but it was an accomplishment that I expected at least the recognition of that piece of paper that I framed on the wall, because that degree took much longer than the one before it, even though it shouldn't have. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so sometimes maybe you're particularly good about this, but I think there are a lot of stuff that we do expect recognition for, whether we get it or not, or whether it's actually a great thing or not. Sometimes you just want to be recognized for oh, hey, I did the dishes, but no one said anything and no one cared, and oh, I made dinner and no one said thanks, and or sometimes you do things and you get fully recognized or over-recognized. You ever do something simple for someone and they will thank you profusely? Bill Miller. So, Anne-Marie, you don't know Bill. A saint of a man who was in our church for years and years and years until he passed. If you would give him a ride home, he would thank you about 100 times. And he doesn't live that far away. Towards the end, he was having trouble with his the dexterity of his fingers, so he'd ask me he couldn't get the buttons on his collar. He'd thank you 100 times for something, for very simple things. But yeah, question 2, how do you feel when no one recognizes your accomplishments?
Sometimes I just feel like it goes unnoticed,
Mm-hmm.
If it directly benefits people, it just feels like they expect it to be done
Mm-hmm.
at work or otherwise.
Yeah. A little underappreciated. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. Okay. Let's dig into some of David's accomplishments. So I think there's actually a very good opening in your book. It's probably on the top of page 74. This just sets us up well for where we are in the scriptures. It says, soon after the capture and rebuilding of Jerusalem, David decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant to his new religious and political center. During Saul's reign, the Ark had remained in relative obscurity in Kirjath Jearim, a town on the border with Philistia. So it was in Shiloh for a while. It got moved to Kirjath Jearim after the Philistines had it briefly. And with the rebuilding of Jerusalem, here we are in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 1. Okay. Again, David gathered together all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people that were with him from Baal of Judah to bring up from thence the ark of God, whose name is called by the name of the Lord of hosts that dwelleth between the cherubims. And they set the ark of God upon a new cart, and brought it out of the house of Abinadab that was in Gibeah. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, drove the new cart. They brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was at Gibeah, accompanying the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. David and all the house of Israel played before the Lord on all manner of instruments made of fir wood, even on harps and psalteries, on timbrels and cornets, and on cymbals, whole band. And when they came to Nachon's threshing floor, Uzzah put forth his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God smote him there for his error, and he died by the ark of God. David was displeased, because the Lord had made a breach upon Uzzah, and he called the name of that place Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how shall the ark of the Lord come to me? Okay, before we discuss what happens here, let's do a quick recap on the Ark of the Covenant. Who built the Ark of the Covenant? Do we know this? I guess I'm being a little vague with that. I don't mean the actual craftsman. Yeah, it was under the dominion of Moses when they're wandering through the wilderness. So that's the when. Do you know what it looks like? Do we have a visual image of this? Yeah, maybe? Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so a golden box, a wooden box covered in gold, and you have the two cherubs on top with their wings connect. Really, if you have seen Indiana Jones, they modeled that very as accurately as a picture as you can get from the Bible about it. It typically has the poles that run through it so they can carry it. Okay. Where was the ark typically? Tabernacle. Later it'll be the temple. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So who could interact with this? Who could interact with the Ark of the Covenant? The high priest. Yeah, so when it's transported, you have Levites doing specific tasks. But as far as the actual, religious practice, it was the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement, the Jewish people's most solemn holiday. It's the forgiveness of the covering of sins for the entire nation. That's where you have the two goats or lambs. We get a lot of imagery that later comes out in the cross for shedding of blood for the atonement of sin. So once a year, this highest priest in the land, he was the only one who could interact with it, and he sprinkled the blood of sacrifice on the ark, and that was it. Otherwise, it was behind its own curtain in the tabernacle or the temple. In the temple, it had doors. But other than that, it's just by itself. So, what do we think about the situation with Uzzah? They weren't supposed to carry it in a cart. they're supposed to carry with the poles. I kind of threw the lead out there a little too much earlier, but yeah, they weren't supposed to carry it with carry it on a cart. Do you blame him too much? Yeah.
It almost seems like it'd be like more, I don't know what the word is for it, but bad, for lack of a better word, to let it fall to the ground rather than to try to stop it from falling.
Yeah. Yeah, like what if it fell over? Well, I have no idea what would have happened. Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird situation. And so Uzzah was one of the sons of Abinadab. Not that you know that name off the top of your head, but the text says that's where the ark was for that long period of time from when it came back from the Philistines until David's moving it. So, like, the ark's been with that family for a very long period of time. He's one of the sons of that man. And, like, him and the other son are trying to take care of it best they can according to the decrees of David. They're bringing the ark to Jerusalem, and technically Uzzah's fault. Like, he's responsible in a way, but you're not upset with him. He's not like a bad guy. But this is what happened. And now it said David was afraid of the Lord. Did it say afraid? Or fear? Afraid, yeah. So normally you think of the fear of the Lord as like a good thing, reverence and respect for the Lord, but him being afraid of the Lord is a little different.
Did they not know, like, because it was a long time, how to transport the ark? Or should they have fully known? And it says they built a cart for it.
Yeah.
And you think it was known that it's not to be on a cart.
You would think that, yeah. So they have the text available to them. That's all we can say. It doesn't say why they did it, although any ideas, any thoughts where they got that idea from? Like, why are we going to put it on a cart?
Plus it's a long distance to carry.
That's true.
They carry it
Yeah.
in the city, but
It's probably heavy.
cart it halfway there.
Isn't that how they tried to the Philistines, or back from the Philistines on the ark?
Yeah, the Philistines put it on a cart. I mean,
So they were, I don't think that they were not educated.
oh no, you expect nothing less from the Philistines, and they needed the donkeys to pull it away because they were cursed from having it in their camp. But yeah, whatever the reason, David is not following. He's kind of just following his heart in a sense. He's not actually, his head's not in the game here. But let's look at verse 10. So David would not remove the ark of the Lord unto him into the city of David, but David carried it aside to the house of Obed-Edom, the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord continued in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. Now on page 75 in your book, question 5 asks, what did God reveal about himself by blessing Obed-Edom's house?
By the mercy of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Willing to, and he appreciated, them.
Yeah, it definitely is his mercy and grace, because it's a strange contrast, like to us, right on the heels of, okay, this guy died just for touching it, but then if it's still treated right, it becomes a source of blessing to this guy's house now. So yeah, you still, like, David's afraid, but then, well, no, you don't have to be afraid. I don't know enough of the Hebrew to know if they're contrasting, like, the fear of the Lord with being afraid of the Lord. I don't know I don't know enough of the language, but at least for us, I think we can understand what the difference between that would be, the humble, reverent respect for the Lord versus, like, he's scared of what's going to happen. It's a couple different things going on there. But let's continue on with this story. So, verse 12. And it was told King David, saying, The Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom, and all that pertaineth unto him, because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And it was so that when they that bare the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed oxen and fatlings. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was girded with a linen ephod. First thoughts on this, right off the bat, anything that jumps out at you?
Along the way, you figured out how to transport.
Mm-hmm.
And there's heaviness.
Mm-hmm. Very happy, yeah. Yeah, so, were you going to say something? Ron? Oh, sorry. Not trying to put you on the spot there. Yeah, so clearly David took the note from, like, God being merciful and blessing Obed-Edom's house. So, okay, like this, God's not against us, we need to do this the right way. Now, there's a lot going on with this story in particular of David bringing the ark back, and I'm considering for the last lesson, the book has it set up like a review of everything, like we did in Judges. I think I might do another custom lesson for that and go through, the book's called Shadows of Shiloh, but so far they don't do a whole lot of pointing out how the stuff in here points to Christ. And this is a big one. There's a lot in the life of David that points ahead to Christ. So I think for the last lesson, we might just kind of do an overview of how different people are pointing to Christ. And this is one of them, because there's a lot of Eden imagery here, and we can look at that. So, okay, first look at verse 13. It was so that when they that bare the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces, he sacrificed oxen and fatlings. So he's making sacrifices. So think about the timing of this. It's with each pace. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sacrifice. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sacrifice. It's creation. So you have the 6 days and God rests on the 7th. There's a whole through line throughout the Bible of temples. So Eden is it's the place where heaven and earth meet. It's where God is and where humans are. They're I'll keep digging into that. We'll dig into this. Also, did you notice what he's wearing? The text is very explicit about that. Yeah, he's wearing the ephod. So we've gone over, this is a priestly garment. Is David a priest? He's not a priest, not technically. But what's being pointed out here is, he never does anything wrong in this capacity. It's not okay, King Saul, he presumptuously actually made sacrifices that only priests were supposed to make. David doesn't do anything out of turn, out of his place, but he looks like a priest in this moment, and he's a king. So I think what the text is doing a good job of pointing you to is there's this Eden imagery that when Adam and Eve are made, they're placed in the garden as the images of God. What they're supposed to do is work and keep the garden. That's the same language that ends up being used of what the priests do in the tabernacle. They work and keep the tabernacle. It's the exact same language in work and worship. In Hebrew, the words are, I think, identical, if not very closely related. And how do I best say this? And Adam and Eve are supposed to subdue the earth. They're the rulers, God makes the earth in the 6 days, and he says, we'll put humans, they'll be my image, they will rule the earth. They'll fill it, they're in charge. So humans' original role in the garden is rulers, and they end up being priests in this intermediary garden temple setup, if this makes sense. It's okay if it doesn't. I might not be explaining it very well. But then after the fall, it's not working right. Humans are kind of always on their quest to get back to Eden. And the roles end up getting shattered and changed, where the priesthood tends to be off and corrupt, and we saw our good deal of corrupt priests in our Judges study, with Eli, with the sons of Samuel. But then you get this figure later in the Bible, earlier than this, who interacts with Abraham, a man named Melchizedek, who is a priest king of God from Jerusalem, like hundreds and hundreds of years before this. And then, of course, you have Psalms, a particular psalm that is quoted in the New Testament a lot, where his seed is going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And so everything in this text is pointing you towards the cycle of creation, is pointing you towards this royal priest. And then we're going to actually see a little more, if you're familiar with the story of Melchizedek, that this will come up a little bit. So let's look at verse 15. Verse 15, so David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of trumpets. And as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, Saul's daughter, looked through a window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And as soon as David had made an end of offering burnt offerings and peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well as to the women as to the men, to everyone a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. So all the people departed, everyone to his house. So not only is David returning the presence of God, he's bringing the presence of God to Jerusalem, this city that from ancient times is known to be the home of the priest king Melchizedek. Are we familiar with the story of Melchizedek? You may have heard the name here and there. So Abraham the patriarch, at a certain point, Lot, his nephew, was kidnapped, him and a whole bunch of people, by these kings. There's this skirmish of these little city-states. The Battle of the Five Kings. And Abraham is able to rally his men, somehow take back whatever was stolen. They are able to kill a bunch of these people, chase them off. They get all the stuff back. And there are several kings who their stuff was taken to, and they're all coming and discussing things with Abraham. And there's this one king named Melchizedek, and he's called the king of Salem. And we're to understand that this is Jerusalem. Salem means peace, so he's the king of peace. And he comes, and even though he's not Jewish, no one's really Jewish yet at that point, but he's this king of a city that we've never heard of, and he is a priest of God Most High, and him and Abraham both believe they know they're talking about the same God, they worship the same God, and Melchizedek brings him bread and wine, and then Abraham gives him a tithe, a tenth of everything that he's taken from these 5 kings. And then we never hear about him again. We start getting hints of him later because he symbolizes this, like the image of God, how humans were, how they were supposed to be. And there's always this idea that the Levitical priesthood is a lesser priesthood. It's not something that was supposed to exist. Because if you remember the story of Moses, Moses was supposed to go and do his thing in Egypt, but then he wouldn't. He kept making excuse after excuse until God says, fine, I'll send your brother with you, Aaron. And it's Aaron's line that ends up being the priests. Like, Aaron wasn't supposed to be involved. Moses was supposed to be the leader of this people. And from the beginning, you have Aaron making the golden calf. You have some of his sons being killed when they offer strange fire in the tabernacle. And you have nothing but like negative stories of the priesthood. Like, yeah, we talked about in Judges, in Judges, they're the ones at the end with like the stuff with the concubine. Eli is a prime example of a corrupt priest. His sons are corrupt. But then we start getting hints back of this Melchizedek, this priesthood, this king, this priest. And David looks as much like that right now as possible. He's going to the same city with the Ark of God. He is a priest. He's a king dressed like a priest, and he literally gives the people bread and wine to take home, and some meat, because he's a little more generous, I guess. He's got the ability to give them meat. And yeah, I think when we have the ability to really push this forward to Christ, I think we'll see more. And the book doesn't go into all of this, but to me it was a little too big of a thing to just pass over. And what I told you is really just, I'm sorry I have to tell it to you so quickly. I know there's a lot to it.
Yeah, people, you can tell this Christ is the ultimate king, priest, right? So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, the idea...
it's looking to him.
Yes, yeah, because there's always this idea that the Levitical priesthood, Aaron's priesthood, it was a concession that God made. It was always to be replaced by something greater. And you have this figure, this Melchizedek, who he ends up symbolizing in thought the king priest, like the good image of God, how men were supposed to be, and it ends up being
Inferior. That's the word I use. Inferior.
Aaron's what?
Yeah, Aaron.
Yes.
And it plays out, it's always inferior.
Yes.
Looking for a better priesthood,
Mm-hmm.
and that's in Christ.
Yeah. And because to be a priest in the line of Aaron, well, I kind of just put it right there. You have to be in the line of Aaron. And the New Testament, especially the book of Hebrews, delves into this idea where Melchizedek, he obviously was not in the line of Aaron. He's about 500 years older than Aaron. He was a priest because God made him a priest, and that's kind of what's spelled out there. It didn't matter about his lineage, and it gets confusing in Hebrews because they say he has, no father, no mother, yeah, so what they say he has no father, no mother, no beginning of days or end of days, and people go, well, I know he's like this image of Christ. Maybe that means he's eternal. Like, no, he doesn't, there's no lineage mentioned. He's not a priest because he's in the line of Aaron. We don't know, the Bible never says when he was born, when he died. He's a priest because he's a king and a priest because God made him a king and priest. And the idea of his priesthood is that's what God intends for the future, that humans would walk in the image of God. Humans would be the image of God. They would rule with God. They would intercede. They would be this place where heaven and earth meet like priests are in the temple. And it has its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus, who is the king, the priest, the exact image of God. So you might not see it right away, like if you just read 2 Samuel 6, but it's doing everything it can in ancient Near Eastern narrative style to go, oh, remember Jerusalem. Remember where that was, guys? Oh, bread and wine. He's wearing an ephod, by the way. Like, just dropping these clues all throughout that really are pointing you back, and by the end of the story, realize it's pulling you ahead as well. So I don't know how much we'll cover when we do it, but I think the final lesson kind of showing Christ in a lot of the stuff that's going on here will be helpful, I think. So yeah, we spent a lot more time with that than I planned to. So we'll keep going with it. We'll see what we get done. Okay, I won't actually get into the rest of the chapter. He has a really bizarre fight with his wife, with Saul's daughter, who he obtained back. Basically, she does not like that he is singing and dancing, and she kind of thinks he's making a fool of himself in front of all the people. She definitely shows she understandably has some problems with David after everything that's transpired. Oh, yeah, so it ends, verse 23, after this argument, therefore, the daughter of Saul had no child until the day of her death.
Did she just decide to walk away from this? I know, did he say,
It could have been mutual. Yeah, whatever happens, they do not produce children from this marriage anymore, or ever. They didn't have a child to begin with. Yeah, he's really upset with her and kind of throws in her face a little bit, like, hey, God chose me over your father to be king. You know what? I'm going to do what's right by God, not by the standards you hold. So, yeah, there's probably it's probably mutual. Yeah, you're probably on with that. Okay. Let's go to chapter 7. Okay, so we just brought the Ark of the Covenant. Chapter 7, verse 1. And it came to pass, when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all his enemies, that the king said unto Nathan the prophet, See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells within curtains. And Nathan said unto the king, Go, do all that is in thy heart, for the Lord is with thee. Yeah, we'll just keep going to verse 4. It came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came unto Nathan, saying, Go and tell my servant David, Thus saith the Lord, shalt thou build a house for me to dwell in? Whereas I have not dwelt in any house since the time that I brought up the children of Israel out of Egypt, even to this day, but have walked in a tent and in a tabernacle. In all the places wherein I have walked with the children of Israel, spake I a word with any of the tribes of Israel, whom I commanded to feed my people Israel, saying, Why build ye me not a house of cedar? Now therefore, so shalt thou say unto my servant David, Thus saith the Lord of hosts, I took thee from the sheepcote, from following the sheep, to be ruler over my people, over Israel. And I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off all thy enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are in the earth. Moreover, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in the place of their own, and move no more. Neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more as before time. And since the time that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee rest from all thy enemies, also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee a house. Okay. That's odd and wordy, and that it has a weird flow to it. What's happening here? Why? So, okay. David says, hey, I'm living in a palace now. I just put the ark in a tent. Okay. Why can't he build a temple? According to this. Or what does God say? I can simplify it.
Is to say God didn't need a temple, and it's been a tent for, since the beginning of this, and that they recently brought up out of Egypt, and that, he's never been asked before to build one, neither has he asked anyone to build one
Mm-hmm.
for him, and there just doesn't seem to be a reason to do so.
Yeah, he kind of points out, well, that there's not a huge need here for this. I've been fine, without, God's been fine without a big temple. But it is interesting. So God immediately starts telling Nathan, like, okay, David wants to do something for me, great, but like God's kind of the one who does things for Israel. Now, I find it interesting that here, that's all that's said, and we'll finish the conversation with David and Nathan. But we do get in 1 Chronicles 22:8. 1 Chronicles, Chronicles retells the stories of the kings, but from a different perspective. In 1 Chronicles 22:8, that's where you get the line where basically God informs David that you have been a man of war, but my house will be built by a man of peace. Now, did anyone have that in their head when I asking about why David can't build a temple?
Yeah, I was going to say it, but it ain't that.
It's not right. Okay. Okay, so I got most people weren't familiar with that. That's interesting, because I always knew David's a man of war. He's not the one to build a temple. But yeah, it's not in this text. God doesn't even seem to give a reason in this text. He just says I don't need it per se. But did you notice, there's a couple interesting things to notice. So when David makes this statement about, I live in a palace, the ark is in a tent, Nathan says, go do what's in your heart, the Lord's with you. Which is interesting because God quickly corrects that. Now, of course, God is still with David, but it's interesting that here Nathan he's a wrong prophet. He's not a false prophet. I think there's a difference. He spoke on God's behalf incorrectly, but when God corrected it, he immediately, he's fine with it. He's not being deceitful. He spoke of his own accord, but as God filled him in, he is perfectly happy to go back and disappoint the king. Although I don't think it's too much of a disappointment, because we'll see what happens there. Because did you notice, what does David want to do? He says, verse 5, go tell my servant David, thus saith the Lord, shalt thou build me a house for me to dwell in? And then look at the end of verse 11. Also, the Lord telleth thee, David, that he will make thee a house. So it starts off with, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. And this is how it's going to play out. Verse 12. And when thy David's days be fulfilled, and thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build me a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he shall be my son. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart away from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established forever before thee. Thy throne shall be established forever. According to all these words, and according to this vision, so did Nathan speak unto David. So it's not called this in the text, but this will be referred to as the Davidic covenant by people. It's not used a lot in the Bible. Whenever scholars, teachers talk about it, they'll call it the Davidic covenant. It's maybe referred to as the covenant with the house of David. And this is basically why a child of David is on the throne going forward. God promises not to take away the throne from his line. He loves David. He is blessing David in this unique way. Saul lost his throne because of his sin. This won't happen with the line of David. And again, this is also something that's pointing forward to Christ, because especially after the exile, when Babylon destroys Jerusalem, again because of sin, we're always looking for, well, who's the one who's going to be sitting on David's throne? This promise that God made all this time ago, God's been faithful in all these things. Who's the king? Who's the one who's going to sit on the throne of David? Who's going to rule for God? This is a question that's in the mind of Israel. That's why they're looking for this Messiah, this King of the Jews. And that brings us to the story of Jesus. So this has three components to it, this covenant. Verse 10, he gives him land, which they already had, but this is kind of doubling down on the covenant with Abraham, with the people of Israel in general, that they'll have the land, there'll be a blessing. Verse 12, he promises him the lineage, his son. He's going to build a temple. And verse 13, that this house will continue. So he kind of links him back into the promises of Israel as a whole nation, that you're supposed to be thinking of the promises that go back to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, that through you I will bless all nations, that promise. And yeah, he's told about the son who's going to sit on the throne, the special relationship that God will have with this son, and that his house, his lineage will not be taken off of the throne. And look at verse 18. Immediately after this, then went King David in and sat before the Lord, and he said, "Who am I, O Lord God, and what is my house that thou hast brought me hitherto?" We won't read the whole prayer. It goes through the end of the chapter. But it's very interesting that, and it's telling of David, that after hearing this, the first thing he does, I don't know where he goes. I don't know if that implies that he goes to the tabernacle that's set up or where he goes. But his immediate reaction is to humbly pray. And he brings all this before God and who am I that you're giving me this incredible blessing? And he still wants the blessing. He asks God to maintain this, but it's a very nice, humble prayer, shows David's heart is really where it should be. And this is David at his best. This is the David that we know and love, the man after God's own heart. So that's a nice section. Okay, go to page 78 in your book. It's probably towards the bottom. There's a line that starts off with, "The events described in 2 Samuel 8 summarize David's military victories. Chronologically, they fit between chapters 5 and 6. In the course of time, David conquered all the territories surrounding the nation of Israel, the Philistines, Moabites, Zobah, and the Syrians. The Philistines were permanently subdued." And then a little bit down, if not on page 79, I'm not sure, Israel's stunning victories by God's power allowed David to consolidate his kingdom and gain a great military reputation. So much so that the king of Hamath sent congratulations and gifts of silver, gold, and bronze. David's fame spread far and wide, especially after he slaughtered 18,000 Syrians in the Valley of Salt. During this time of great victories, David ruled his people with judgment and justice. So yeah, verse 8 is just all military accomplishments, shows his blessing, shows he's obtaining the land that God has promised him, the fuller kingdom of Israel. And we got about 15 minutes. So we're going to read chapter 9. It's a short chapter, and tells a self-contained story that you may not be familiar with. Chapter 9, verse 1. And David said, "Is there yet any that is left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when they had called him unto David, the king said unto him, Art thou Ziba? He said, Thy servant is here. The king said, Is there not yet any in the house of Saul, that I may show the kindness of God unto him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan had yet a son, which is lame on his feet. And the king said unto him, Where is he? Ziba said unto the king, Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. Then King David sent and fetched him out of the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, from Lodabar. Now when Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth. He answered, Behold, thy servant. David said unto him, Fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. He bowed himself and said, What is thy servant that thou shouldst look upon a dead dog such as I am? Then the king called to Ziba, Saul's servant, and said unto him, I've given unto thy master's son all that pertains to Saul and to all his house. Thou therefore and thy sons and thy servants shall till the land for him. Thou shalt bring in the fruits, and thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then said Ziba unto the king, According to all that my lord the king has commanded his servant, so shall thy servant do. As for Mephibosheth, said the king, he shall eat at my table as one of the king's sons. And Mephibosheth had a young son, whose name was Micah, and all that dwell in the house of Ziba were servants unto Mephibosheth. And so Mephibosheth dwelt in Jerusalem, for he did eat continually at the king's table, and was lame on both his feet. Interesting little self-contained story. We didn't read text like, was it in 1 Samuel? The author sets you up for this. He kind of paces ahead where when the Philistines are attacking for their last attack before Saul dies, the servant takes young baby or child, Mephibosheth. They're taking them away from the castle to safety. Someone trips and falls, and his feet are crushed, and it's just kind of like this odd little, okay, someone got away with one of Saul's grandchildren, Jonathan's son, and we get the fulfillment of it here in chapter 9. It kind of set up and pay off later. What do you think of this story? What jumps out at you? What's weird? What's interesting?
He's paying tribute to Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
Shows a really strong bond that he had with him.
Yeah.
David, we remember that Jonathan,
Mm-hmm.
to think that Jonathan had died, but then David continues to think about him,
Mm-hmm.
desires to just help
Yeah.
any relative of his.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Anything else jump out at you about it? Any idea why it's like what it's doing here? It's a good boy's name, right? Mephibosheth. Yeah, we'll use that someday. Yeah, so of course he's. Were you going to say something? No. Okay.
I was just saying he didn't have any children with Jonathan's sister, right?
Mm.
So he would have having Jonathan would have having nieces or nephews, so it's kind of like cutting off the line of Saul.
Yeah.
There's no immediate, family
Yeah.
children to Saul with him. So that to Jonathan, he just, I guess, showing respect to his family because they were such close friends.
Mm.
I guess they wanted to honor Saul too, but Saul was, out to get him. He didn't have
Yeah.
ill will against him other than, God anointed him.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't set well with Saul, so I guess this is kind of a way of making a
Mm-hmm.
peace offering, so to speak, in a way,
Yeah.
to his family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he was crippled too, he just took him in anyway. And
Right.
sat him at his table and gave him back all the lands and had people till his fields and it was
Mm-hmm.
such a
He could have been like, I'm gonna take all, like, I got all land, but he decided to give that
Mm-hmm.
portion back to the rest of the family.
Mm-hmm.
That's not stretching on that.
No, it's
I don't know if that's correct or not, that's what I kind of thought.
uh-huh. Yeah.
Jonathan deserves something because he died along with his father.
Mm-hmm.
And his family, when Jonathan died in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of implications that you could pull out, a lot of speculations you could do, and the relationships run deep. So of course, as you guys mentioned, he still considers his covenant with Jonathan all these years later. And I think this is another example of David at his absolute best. And here he's the merciful king. And this story is used as a really, really good example of like God's mercy. Because when you just lay out the elements, so you have this man is literally physically broken, but he is restored. He's made a son of the king, and he's given an inheritance. Every one of those aspects kind of lines up with, like, he could be an enemy. He's the last of the line of Saul, but David takes him in his broken, rundown state, feeds him, gives him gives him the land that he didn't have. It's used as a really good example of God's grace, especially to us. It's a really good picture of salvation. He's literally unable to do anything for himself. He's crippled. He can't walk.
It's like the priestly king
Mm-hmm.
is showing mercy to somebody of low estate
Mm-hmm.
and completely unable to take care of himself on his own. He's welcomed into the family of the king.
Yes.
This is the king's table,
Mm-hmm.
part of the king's family, and is taken care of and all that type of thing. So that's all pictures.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Things in Christ will be.
That's the promise of salvation,
Yeah.
make us part of the kingdom.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Showing mercy in his helpless estate.
Yeah. Yep. An enemy house, a helpless person, and it's been pointed out that so his feet are bad, but when he's sitting at the king's table, there's no sign of insufficiency here. Not only because David treats him as a son, but literally when everyone's seated at the table, his brokenness has no bearing on that situation, and it's just a really nice picture of David's mercy. It's a good picture of God's mercy, and this ends up being exactly the type of stuff that Jesus does for us in his earthly life, in our lives. So it seems like an odd little why is this random story in here of him just. I guess it's nice that he helps Jonathan's son, but yeah, it's a really incredible picture of him being, again, the man after God's own heart, and that carries forward for a long time. Okay, the last story, we have just enough time to talk about what we need to. Chapter 10, verse 1. Came to pass after this that the king of the children of Ammon died, and Hanun his son reigned in his stead. Then said David, I will show kindness unto Hanun, the son of Nahash, as his father showed kindness unto me. David sent to comfort him by the hand of his servant for his father. And David's servants came into the land of the children of Ammon, and the princes of the children of Ammon said unto Hanun their lord, Thinkest thou that David does honor thy father, that he has sent comforters unto thee? Hath not David rather sent his servants unto thee to search the city and spy it out and overthrow it? Wherefore Hanun took David's servants and shaved off the one half of their beards and cut off their garments in the middle, even to their buttocks, and sent them away. Okay, this is an odd one. Shaving half the beard. So we can, like, for us, that's hysterical. Like, that you can picture that, and that's a really funny thing. Back then, it was just as embarrassing, but it was like, no, it was not just as embarrassing. It wouldn't have been funny, it would have been a sign of shame. So the beard is the mark of a man in ancient Near Eastern culture. Like, when you had the ability to grow a beard, you grew it, especially like the Jewish men. They usually didn't shave them. They were like long and scraggly. The beard is manhood, it's wisdom. So they shave off like half their beards, send them away in disgrace, cut up their clothing so they're half naked. So in your book on page 79, they do a recap of what happens next. Realizing their actions could lead to war, the Ammonites put together a coalition of 33,000 troops from Syria and other nations prepared for battle against Israel. Joab, David's deputy, also readied his troops. The Ammonites gathered at the city gates while the Syrian coalition encamped in a field. Joab realized that his soldiers were caught in a pincer movement with no way of escape. Therefore, he deployed a large portion of his troops to immediately go against Syria. Overwhelmed, the Syrians fled. The rest of Israel's army, under Abishai, routed the Ammonites, and Joab returned to Jerusalem. Later, the Syrian coalition regrouped with additional troops from beyond the Euphrates River. They took a position at Helam, 100 miles north of Jerusalem. When David heard of this threat, he summoned his troops and marched across the Jordan River to engage the enemy at Helam. Overpowered, the Syrians hastily withdrew. David's men pursued them and slaughtered 700 charioteers, 40,000 foot soldiers, and the commander of the entire army. The Syrians who surrendered became Israel's subjects, and they were afraid to give any more assistance to the Ammonites. I would imagine so. Did not go well for the Syrians. And if you're wondering about the placement of that, I think you have him showing mercy to a friend and showing mercy to an enemy with very different outcomes. His mercy is not, his kindness and mercy are not taken from the pagans, where he was literally just like, hey, send messengers, sorry about the death, like a best wishes type thing, whatever he could do and bring them in that time. And it ends in war and God once again expanding. I don't know if they got any land from this. I'd have to check that. But at the very least, he took out some of God's enemies. He built himself up. David is now even more of a formidable king and opponent. As per usual, actually, David's kindness is treated with contempt. That was his whole experience under Saul. And once again, this is coming to fruition. So we covered sort of a lot. We got a big sidetrack with the whole Melchizedek situation. I didn't plan on that. But we saw David's worship. We saw his desire with the temple. We saw God's covenant with him, compassion for a friend, and compassion for an enemy. So there's a lot in... A lot of this wasn't like, except for that end, there wasn't a lot of battles, a lot of fights. It wasn't a lot of political intrigue like we've had. But there's a lot of stuff here, a lot of deep stuff, a lot of prophetic stuff, a lot of symbolism, imagery, typology, if that makes sense. So yeah, we saw a lot here, but before we end, any questions, any thoughts, anything? Okay, good. Perfect. So yeah, in making it personal, it just says, how have you responded to your accomplishments? And who do you want to receive the glory for your accomplishments? And I think pointing out David's reactions with what God has done for him, how he's trying to glorify God in every move he's making. Hey, I'm in a palace. What about God? What can I do for... Here's what God's done for me. What can I do for him? How can I bring glory to his kingdom, to what he's doing? How can I show kindness to enemies, to all these different people? So, yeah, there are a lot of accomplishments under David's belt in this one, and he is responding to them all by praising God, thanking God, giving glory back to God, and doing what he can for the kingdom. So, shining moments in King David's rule here. We have no gray areas to consider like we have in past lessons. So, yeah, this is David at his best. This is David picturing Christ to come as the image of God, the man after God's own heart. This is his shining chapters here. And we'll get into more of them with his reign next week. So let's close in a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you for these images, these stories, this history that even from thousands of years ago, we can still see someone who is seeking you, seeking to honor and glorify you. And we thank you for just how you've used David's life and how it all points ahead to the greater David, the one who will reign on that throne for eternity, the one who will show us the same mercy that David showed to his friends and enemies. And we just thank you for all the things that you've shown us in your word and the salvation that it ultimately culminates in. So we thank you for your word and your study, and pray you bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, thank you.